I am so incredibly happy to be able to have this conversation with you, Lord Browne, because I've known you for quite a while, even though you've not known me. I still remember when I was given a copy of your book, The Glass Closet, by a friend of mine, and I just thought it was it was the best books I've read about that kind of relationship and the role of diversity within the business community. So I'm particularly pleased to be here sitting next to you today, because as everyone here of course knows, you are one of Britain's greatest and most highly paid businessmen, especially of course BP, where you worked for more than 40 years and where you started as 1966 as a very junior intern and of course worked your way up. I mean, before you got to the very top, you served, I believe, in Alaska, New York, San Francisco, London, Canada. And I've got a list here of just how rapid that rise was. And I just want to go through it just to really reiterate what a remarkable career you have had in different fields. In 1984, you were Group Treasurer, Chief Executive of BP Finance International. Only 2 years later, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of the Standard Oil of Iowa. 1 year later, following the BP Standard merger, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of BP America, as well as Chief Executive Officer of Standard Oil Production Company. 1989, notice how quickly this is going through. 1989, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of BP's Exploration, based in London here. 1991, you joined the board, Managing Director, and then of course Heaven, Chief Executive, 1995. And by the time you left in 2007, you had built this company up to a real global business, a global giant in the field. Now, you've already heard some of the other things you've done as well as those minor achievements. President, Royal Academy of Engineering, you were knighted, 1998, named by the House of Lords as People's Peer, 2001, been Chairman of Trustees of Tate Gallery, chaired independent review into the university's tuition fees, 2010, chaired L1 Energy. You see how this goes on and on, written books, collected art, from your first sort of collection of David Hockney's lithogram when you were 21, and so on and so on and so on. So I'm hoping I'm giving a sense here of just the range of things that you have done, and I'm going to apologize for not mentioning a 100th of the things you have done, but we do want to have dinner sometime later this evening. So I guess where I want to start is your family background. I mean, what is it that kind of led you to the field you eventually arrived at, and what influence did your family have on that journey?
Just before I do that, I just want to say how happy I am to see Janet, and how happy I am to be here doing something in honour of someone I really liked. Very, very much indeed. Very, very much.
I know Colin would be very, very happy that you're here.
Thank you. So, my family is a very odd family. Most families are odd, I think. There are plenty of books about that. But my father was a British person from Norfolk. The Brownes came from Norwich for quite a long time. And he was a professional soldier when the war started. And he fought a good war. Ending up, as everyone who did that, back out of uniform into a suit, but actually really being a soldier still, being one of the military, actually now civilian governors of a bit of Germany. And you couldn't be in uniform for all sorts of peace reasons, but he was basically running a place. And he needed and he was very good. He spoke Arabic and Farsi, so that's why they sent him to Germany. And so he needed someone who couldn't speak any other languages except English. So he needed an interpreter, translator. And lo and behold, my mother appeared who had been liberated from Auschwitz. She'd survived, one of the last of her family. Most of them had been murdered by the Germans. And she appeared and she translated. She spoke half a dozen languages, all European, no Middle Eastern. And lo and behold, they got married. And so they got married, and my mother became a Brit, which she was very proud of. Although, as Janet probably remembers, she never ever lost her Hungarian accent or her Hungarian construction of sentences, which is an amalgam of German and English in a very clumsy way. But it certainly was remarkable. So armed with that, we travelled the world. I think I was one of the very first Junior Jet Club members of BOAC, hence creating a lifetime addiction to air travel. So I was travelling back and forth from a boarding school in Cambridgeshire, Ely, which had no central heating at all, and I didn't understand that. My mother thought it was totally barbaric, and my father thought it was the way you made men, you know. And so, I actually think I agree with my mother to some extent. So I was always taught several things. My mother was obviously affected by her time in Auschwitz. She taught me about how not to tell people secrets because they always use them against you. And she taught me about minorities, where if the going gets tough, the minorities are always hurt by the majority. And my father always taught me about making sure that standards never slipped, because that's what he did during the war. And he died in 1980. My mother stayed on. I then was, she lived until 2000. But I was, by definition, educated. From my mother's point of view, there was no quarter, there was no reason why you didn't do very well every day. And if you didn't, you had to explain yourself. And so that was typically the way I was brought up. So I went to Cambridge, read natural sciences, which was exactly as expected. And I then got offered a research fellowship at Cambridge. Then my father intervened. At that point he said, "Don't you think you should get a real job?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, this is a real job, you know, they pay me." He said, no, a real job. And he said, "Well, after all, if you don't have a job, how do you know you don't like it? How do you know?" So I lost that argument, and I decided to apply to the company he'd just retired from, BP. And being an arrogant little boy at 21, I said, "Well, I want to join you, but I'd like to join you for a year, and I want you to send me to America," because I'd traveled the world and I'd never been to the US. So they agreed to both things, remarkably. So off I went to BP. I did a lot of training, breaking up cliffs in Dorset, trying to understand geology as a physicist. And then I got my posting papers, which read, "Dear Browne," they talked in those terms in those days, "please report to Anchorage, Alaska on the 14th of November, 1969. That's not what I had in mind, I was thinking. But anyway, it was the start of a great experience, and one year led to another. I learnt a lot. I had to get a night school. I was working shift, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, up in north of the Arctic Circle. It was very undeveloped. It was an amazing experience. And in order to become an engineer, because being a physicist was really quite useless, I had to go to night school, which I did in the Anchorage Community College. And I saw a completely different side of life. Amazing people learning at night to become state-registered engineers of the state of Alaska. Because if you didn't have a stamp, you couldn't do anything. You were not registered. So that's what I did, and then my boss one day said to me, "Would you like to come to New York?" And I said, "When do I pack?" And off I went.
I mean, it sounds like that experience of night school, which I'd forgotten actually from the books. I mean, it's kind of like the mechanics institution, Birkbeck's, predecessors, 200 years ago, that kind of institution where people who are working during the day actually go and get a decent education.
Well, I had I actually had very wise people who, in those days, had time, especially in Anchorage, because it was up and down, the work was up and down, to actually teach you, and they were quite interested in doing that. So the first thing which I really benefited from, again and again in my career, was to go and get my hands dirty. And, here I was, with a very good first from Cambridge, ready to do, and then I was literally given a spanner and said, just do something. And I had worked with a lot of different characters. And I learnt about how you couldn't get things done unless you cooperated, and how you built yourself into a team, you were part of a team, and eventually I learned how to lead a team. But, and I learned about unions. Actually, when I had a very small summer job at Llandarcy Refinery, which is now demolished, it's now the University of Wales, actually, is now on the land. I was doing some work in the lab, and I had to go and collect oil and make samples. And one of the fuses went in a plug, and I proceeded to change it. And the union organizer came to me and said, we may go out for that, because demarcation was alive and well. So you didn't change a fuse unless you were a member of the electricians union. And it was a big learning to me, that actually you had to understand the rules of the game to live. I mean, I objected to those rules, but they were the rules.
I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about your entire career, and what you just said then, it kind of exemplifies it, is this ability to be flexible, to be willing to think outside of certain boxes, and be willing to innovate. If I can just point one thing in your book, Beyond Business, which really interested me. You write at one place here, you wrote, the company I joined in 1969 was called British Petroleum, BP for short, and had been owned in part by the British government. By the end of the 20th century, we were no longer British, more a multinational. We were no longer simply petroleum, because we were now investing in gas and alternative energies. In addition, the symbolic trademark BP Shield looked very dated and smacked of an imperial past. And what interested me is how you sort of went about, both in terms of the nuts and bolts, but as well as the big conceptual issues, how you went about actually trying to, if you like, change, revolutionize BP. And I'm particularly interested in this sort of greening of BP.
Well, I think it's worth starting at the brand. It was, the way BP was thought of was very British, overly British. And we just merged and purchased companies that the sum total of which were larger than the company that bought them. So we were, in some ways, the wrong way round. And so we had to, necessity required us to rethink what we stood for and what we were really doing in the world. So I think, and I did this by having a gigantic but very focused consultation with the team inside the company. So everybody began to understand what it is. We understood more about what we stood for, what we were, and they did too. And one of the obvious things is this, that if you look at the progress, at the changes in the way people use energy, almost from, I think it was my very old friend Peter Hennessy, I think, told me a slightly false historical fact. He said, one of the reasons the Roman Empire collapsed was they ran out of wood, because they burnt too much of it, and it's partly true. It's not wholly true, I think.
I'll give you some books to read.
But I thought that was quite a good one. But actually, the way in which progress, the human progress, is marked by changes in energy, whether it's coal coming in and making the human 70 times more powerful than they are by themselves, or whether it's the invention of oil for transportation and that sense of freedom that people had in the 50s and 60s, and they had in America these big cars that symbolized, I'm in charge of myself, I can go from one coast to the other, and it's me, It was all about that, and whether, aeroplanes. I mean, I remember, when traveling on an aeroplane was a very unusual thing to do, very high-end activity, very few people, and now, everyone can do it. All of this is about changes of fuel. And I remember here, some of the people in this room will remember the switch to North Sea gas, from that terrible gas that smelt ghastly with the making coal into gas. Natural gas began at that point to take over from coal, and all of it was cleaner and cleaner. And after natural gas, it was, could the technologies of using the sun and the wind actually take the place? And the answer is yes, it can. It still needs more development. And we could see that in the 90s, and it was time for BP to participate. In just saying that we participated, the very big thing that it does, of course, is send a very big signal to the people around you, whether you're customers, and more importantly, whether it's people who want to join the company, that you're in touch with contemporary thinking. You're actually in touch, and that means people want to come and work with you. And that's what we found, is as we were doing all these transformations, the quality and range of people who wanted to come and join BP went up and up and up because of that just one thing. I think to say, well, we are, in an industry that never changes, whatever industry it is a sheer nonsense and repels people from you. They just don't like it very much.
Yeah. I know in the book you write very eloquently about the challenge of that hurdle of rebranding and the difficulties that were involved in that. I was really curious though about if you were just to give one or maybe two, it's up to you, other examples where sort of the greatest hurdles you think you faced in the company and how you overcome them. I was curious which one or two you might choose.
Well, I would like to start with things that went wrong, maybe. That's, I think, a better way of looking at this. So one of the big challenges in a company is you get a lot of momentum. So people begin to say, right, we're all behind you, and we must do things the way that, quote, BP did things. So we rebranded, we had a brand new brand, and people said, and that means we must eliminate every brand. It will be the supremacy of the BP brand. And I didn't stop it. And it was so wrong, because actually we managed to eliminate a brilliant brand called Amoco that actually was better than BP in the US. So it's a mistake by thinking that actually momentum requires people to, you need odd people to come and say, excuse me, I'm throwing myself in front of your body, I'm throwing my body in front of you to stop you doing these stupid things. So we had too much groupthink at that point, and I think we made a mess. So that was, and a very expensive one too. So mistakes like that. I think second mistake was to assume that integration is finished when actually you have the auditors telling you that it's finished and the internal corporate control people saying you've filled all the objectives. Actually, that might not be right, because people take time to accommodate change, and that time is very variable. It just depends on the context in which they exist. In BP's case, this created a tragedy. And in 2005, we had a fire at a first time ever at a big refinery in Texas, which we managed to create the environment where 15 people were killed. And that was tragic. It was terrible for the people. And BP, I think, learned a very big lesson that, number one, integration can't be presumed, and number two, no system, however good it is good enough. And so safety is prime. I mean, nothing at all can be done that compromises safety, but you have to be so clear about that to every single individual, and we failed in that area. Now, we managed to compensate for what it's worth. We compensated people. We sort of stopped the rot of that, the terrible problems and the rot inside the company very quickly. In 2 years, we had sorted it out, but it should never have happened.
Yes, and I remembered at the time it was quite a dent for BP itself
Very big dent.
as a company. I mean, you're speaking here
It was
amongst...
an emotional dent.
Yes.
Financially, not a big dent, Whereas Macondo, which happened after I left, financially, of course, took away 40% of the company.
Yeah. I mean, you're speaking here quite openly amongst this group of mistakes. And, in hindsight, we can do that. As a businessman, I'm talking here about the business part of your career. How do you at the time admit to mistakes like such a great tragedy? What do you do as a businessman?
You have, I think, as time goes by, I mean, I certainly realised, and of course it's easy, I now really realise, I suppose, that there's no substitute for saying it absolutely the way it is. So, for example, Texas City, I was actually in California when I heard the call, and I flew down to Texas City that evening, and I arrived and I was surrounded by my internal staff, about 30 lawyers, PR people, HR people, lots of people. And the big message was, you mustn't say anything. So I said, but I have to go to the refinery. So I said, well, thank you for advice. I noted. The next morning they said, we want to come with you. And I said, no, I will take my executive assistant and my one person, and we'd go to the refinery. So I went to the refinery, and they'd set up a press conference, I think, about 2 hours after I'd arrived. But we went round, and we, at that moment, pulled out the final body, the 15th person. And I met all the staff, I spoke to them, and they were in terrible distress. They didn't quite know what had happened and why it had happened, and they weren't angry, they were just shocked. So at the press conference, I decided, as I was doing this, that I would, based on my own responsibility, I got up and I said to the world's press, ladies and gentlemen, BP's accountable for this and will take care of it. And at that moment, the press didn't know what to do. If you watch the video, there's a pause while people are they asked me to repeat it because there were no further questions that they could really ask. I think they were assuming that we would defend it. We, of course, we didn't defend it. We defended the scale of the compensation. That's very different. And whether people were trying to defraud the company, well, we admitted immediately and we just got on with it. And I somehow think that's the right way today, because and I think it's a very high accountability for people in business. Business, when I first joined business, I mean, you could hide away virtually anything because there was a, great deep respect for authority. People would sort of interview a CEO and say, CEO, please impart pearls of wisdom to the nation. They wouldn't say, what's wrong, what have you done wrong? And today, they not only do that, but of course, so do thousands of people who are watching what you're doing. So I'm always amazed when people say, well, we didn't actually do that, when it's evident that they did. So, Volkswagen, it took several goes, for example, for them to admit that actually they had effectively defrauded their customers. And had they just said, okay, we found out it's wrong, let's get on and fix it, probably in the end would have been better for their reputation and actually cheaper. Because people take retribution against those who do not admit. They take retribution, but if you get on with it, I think even the worst form of tort lawyer, doesn't get his way in court because people say, well, look, they admitted it. Now we're just dealing with the amount of money, not anything else. So I think that's quite important, and I think as I look at companies, so often they make statements in words that nobody understands, in language that is very arcane, and it's designed to limit the amount that they tell you. So, these press releases, I've been involved in it, where people spend, a day trying to work on exactly what words to use here and there. They, of course, immediately go into the nominal waste paper basket now. And people really want to know what actually happened, and they can find out. So I think it's a big change. It's about engaging people on the basis that that they know. They always do.
I like this idea of moral courage is better business. I think that's a nice slogan.
But it's not meant to be that. I think
Yes.
you have to be careful, otherwise you sound like you're saying, and now let me read you another chapter of moral code or the Bible.
Okay.
It's not that.
Yeah. Well, look, 2007, you were traumatically, unwittingly outed as gay. And in a few minutes, I want to ask you about how you dealt with that event and its aftermath. But before I do that, my favourite book, The Glass Closet, can I just read a poem from your book, which is written by Cavafy. And I just think it's very beautiful, and then I'll turn over to you. And it's called Hidden Things, and it goes like this. From all the things I did and all the things I said, let no one try to find out who I was. An obstacle was there, transforming the actions and the manner of my life. An obstacle was often there to silence me when I began to speak. From my most unnoticed actions and my most veiled writings, from these alone I will be understood. But maybe it's worth so much concern and so much effort to discover who I really am. Later, in a more perfect society, someone else, made just like me, is certain to appear and act freely. I think it's the most beautiful, I love Cavafy anyway, but it's a very, very beautiful poem. Can you reflect on that moment of your life?
Well, the poem itself, I remember living in New York. I lived in the village, but I used to walk along 48th Street to get to the office. We were at that time in a building which is now JP Morgan and used to be Union Carbide, a company that's disappeared. I remember going to a bookshop there and buying a small copy of Cavafy's poems, seeing that poem and actually rewriting it in hand in the front of the book. So when I wrote The Glass Closet, I thought actually and I did that in 1971. I had kept my private life, I thought, pretty secret. I think I remind you, I said my mother taught me two things: never tell a secret to anyone, otherwise that's used against you, and the minority always gets hurt when the majority has a tough time. And that, and combined with the fact that I was at university before 50 years ago, and it's only 50 years ago that being homosexual and doing something about it was made legal, the Wolfenden Report. So I was pretty clear that I would stay in the closet for my whole of my life and not let it get in, my sexuality would not get in the way of anything I did. And I managed to do that, conducting a very discreet private life, quite separate from my public life, until the two combined for all sorts of very bad reasons. And a former partner of mine, who I stopped seeing, decided to sell his story to the Mail. It's a paper, you recall, not the Post. And the Mail then rang BP and said, we've got 39 questions we want to ask Lord Browne about basically, it's all about sex, power and politics. It was a perfect combination for that newspaper, perfect. So I panicked because I was out of the country, and I decided that I would stupidly employ some lawyers, and in those days you could get not only an injunction to stop people printing, you could get a super injunction, which was an injunction on the injunction which stopped people knowing anything about what was going on. They wouldn't even know there's an injunction in place. So I achieved that, and in the process of giving evidence, I actually told a lie, which I corrected about 5 days later, 10 days later, I've forgotten, but about how I met him, because I was too embarrassed to explain how. So that really caused lots of problems. Meanwhile, that was in January, and I realized that it went through the courts, it went to the Court of Appeal, and then my lawyers, who are very, very good, said we have to go to the House of Lords, and I said I think we should stop that. And so on the 1st of May, this injunction failed, and it was released to the public, and the Daily Mail naturally said we won. And for 3 days I was probably the biggest story in the world's press, I think, because it was the first time that first a CEO of a company of that scale was actually seen to be gay. Secondly, I decided that on the basis of my mismanagement of this whole process, that I should resign from BP, so I did on the 1st of May. I didn't even ask the board, I just sent the chairman a letter saying I'd resign, and I said no reply is required. And so I left BP on the 1st of May. I did decide to walk through the front door to literally hundreds of press from all over the world. 3 days I was hounded by people, and after that I had to decide what I was going to do next. So I decided to resign from everything. Some people just refused to take it, but I decided I'd start again, and so I did.
A happy ending, I hope.
Well, it was great fun. It was to think about it. It was disturbing to think about it, but actually to wake up, it's quite interesting. You know, a lot of people come to see me about what they're going to do when they leave being a CEO. And actually, I resigned as a CEO, and actually I had thought, you know, I protected my privacy because I thought that if people knew, they would treat me as sort of irresponsible and not worth bothering with, and unreliable, all sorts of things like that. Actually, quite the reverse happened. As a result of this, everybody, there was a huge set of newspaper letters to the newspapers about this. There were numbers of people who wrote to me, everybody rang, and after 3 days when I went out into the street, where there were no longer photographers hounding me, I actually had strangers come up to me and say, we're right behind you. You know, and so I said to myself, well, I got that wrong then, definitely, and that told me something about what I needed to do in the future. And then I built a different business portfolio.
So today, 10 years later, what would you say to an early career LGBT business person today trying to make their way and kind of follow in your footsteps? What would you tell them? What advice would you be giving them, besides read this wonderful book?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd be very cautious about universal prescriptions, because I don't think they work. This is about a person, it's not about people. It's about a person. So I think the general statement would be, come out as soon as you can, because it just gets worse over time, and you build with your brain lots of barriers, lots of different life, and you could be using your brain for different things, and also not finding the right relationships going forward. So I'd say do that, but do it in a safe way. Do it in a way which keeps you safe. So if you're in Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't recommend it. In Uganda, I think I'd be very careful how you did it. In London, I'd probably be fine, but just remember that you have to handle your relations, your parents, and things like that. The depressing data is this, that in spite of our modern approach to life, people who are out at university, when they join companies, they go back into the closet. Actually, 2/3 of them go back into the closet because they're worried about the new environment they're in, and they can't actually see enough role models of people who've succeeded, who are openly gay. So if you look at the S&P 500, the index of the biggest stocks in the world, and you ask, right, who is openly gay, who's a CEO? You come up with the answer, there is one, and it's Tim Cook of Apple. Nobody else. Nobody else. Statistically, let's say 5% of people are gay and they, at that level, should be open. That means there should be 25. So either 24 people are in the closet, or something has happened in the way people think about their own progress in corporate society. So I've been worrying about that and seeing what can be done in corporate life. In political life, it's really quite accepted. And in other fields of endeavour, it's accepted. Even sport is beginning to, certainly sole performers, not members of teams, it's happening. So I think more progress is needed, and young people need to be careful, but they should try and come out of it as soon as they can.
And what role, I want to move on to your more educational thing, because, I mean, obviously institutions of higher education have potentially a large role to play in making, creating fairer societies. How do you think they ought to be doing that, or what do you think is the way forward for institutions such as Birkbeck to create better societies, fairer ones, more equitable ones?
I want to answer that question in a second, but I also think that schools have a high responsibility here. And I'm particularly keen, for example, that schools should, in a way which is appropriate, people should be encouraged to come up and talk to their parents about it and think about that. I'm supporting a charity that does just that, and with some success. So it's all about starting in a few things at school, make great advances in universities.
Yes, but we all know that there's huge amount of opposition by a lot of parents to that sort of thing. So how do you, yourself in this charity, how do you get around that?
Well, we make it, it's not government money, it's simply the permission of the head teacher or one of the group of teachers to make it happen. So it's not government money, and it's something which is simply yet another lecture and discussion. But I do think, universities, of course, are a great source of witnesses, as well as future thinkers. So in universities, people can examine what is going on and comment in a way which should not have a particular axe to grind. It should be balanced on the facts, should be balanced on the context in which the facts and activities take place. So whether it's a historic context or whether it's a scientific context, it can be done in a way which makes sense as a witness. In addition, of course, new knowledge. But the witness is part of creating a better civil society, it seems to me, as well as teaching people about that.
And what's the link between that role of institutions of higher education and the role of creating better business people? Do you see those two things as separate, or they intertwined, or?
No, very much so. I think business. I would like to say, as a businessman, is one of the great creative forces in the world. It does extraordinary things. It brings people out of poverty. It creates choice. It creates information. It creates transparency. All these sorts of things that we need. But business people are not actually born. They do need to be made. And they need also, it's one of the business is a vocational subject primarily, which needs an understanding of the context within it works. I'm overusing that word, but it's peripheral vision. So someone who knows a lot about finance, it's fine. The consequences of acting on incentives in a financial sense, when applied to society, requires them to understand something about society. Otherwise you get the wrong answer. Banks have demonstrated just that. You know, it's okay to incentivize people to give people mortgages. We all want people to own houses. But if you have people who are incentivized just to sign people up with no responsibility to ensure that they can pay, then you begin to create an interesting bubble, which is exactly what happened in the global financial crisis. So, wrong vision, wrong idea, great idea to start with, but no education. So I like to think that, you know, business is one of those Janus face things. It faces finance and faces the need to create money so it in turn can be sustainable. But it has to face the other way, to look at society and all the stakeholders to stay in business anyway. And I think we're living through an example of that with Uber at the moment. Interesting, great idea, but bashing into brick walls, into society norms wherever they're going. So how that works and whether they will be sustainable is, I think, an open question at the moment.
Excellent. I mean, I've been at Birkbeck ages because I love Birkbeck for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons I love Birkbeck is because of our students, that they come to us in the evenings. Most of them are working during the day. So I know that when I walk into my class, I have got students who are passionate about being educated because they're giving up something. You know, I do have 18-year-olds in my class, but I've got everyone from 18 to 50s and 60s. So I guess, and this is what makes, I think, Birkbeck a unique and actually a wonderful institution in which to work and in which to learn. What do you think can be done to encourage this kind of model of lifelong education, which transforms people's lives, as you know?
I think in the corporate sector, first of all, it should be a requirement. Great companies do continuously retrain, re-educate their teams. They have to do that because what we're doing today is simply not what we were doing 5 years ago, and what we will be doing in 20 years' time with low-end activity, what's called low-end activity at the moment, being totally taken out of the normal human employment system. It will be so necessary. So I think part of it is simply showing people the need and the progress. I was struck when I came to Birkbeck for the Higher Education Review. I spoke to several students and it was interesting how much they'd sacrificed to be here. And the drive was clear because they'd come as in position A, and they were actually earning, some of it wasn't just money, but let's suppose they were earning 10 units, they intended to leave to earn 15. And they were driven to do that. And they were driven while holding down a full-time job in one person had 2 full-time jobs and education, you know, in order to pay for it. So I think it's the need is there. Now, not everyone will do it,
No.
but actually they will be left behind.
Yeah, we've almost run out of time. I just want to ask you one more question, then we're going to have some time when you people can ask questions or make comments. We'll have about 15 minutes. But just to conclude, because I mean, I really have been amazed by your entire career, and it's been very creative, it's been very powerful in many ways, and it's also been very stressful. So tell us all, what in the world do you do to relax?
I just relax.
What, do you lie in bed and watch TV?
No, I go to Venice. I've got a great
I
place
didn't
in
think
Venice.
so.
I go with Nee, and we just relax. I think I'd probably, if I did nothing at all, then I would be deeply stressed. But because even when you go on the beach, I mean, my ambition is then to read a book a day and learn something. And it's a wonderful thing to do. Or have a conversation, just discuss and debate something. So I think for me, relaxing is changing what I'm doing. You know, so when you switch, you know, what do they say? A change is as good as good as rest. It's actually true, I think. You know, we just switch location, switch subject, and it's amazingly relaxing. And what it allows you to do, what it allows me to do at least, is switch the type of person I deal with. Different sorts of people are actually very relaxing. You suddenly realise that life is very big indeed, and you're simply dealing with a very tiny bit of it.
Lovely, thank you. A round of applause and then a Q&A.